let's get started in talking through some of the stuff for today. Again, this is our final full day. So we again are kind of going through some of the darker and more challenging parts of communication, particularly as it relates to verbal aggression, and so on. So last class, we talked about some of the negative patterns of communication in relationships in particular. So some of the ways that we do things such as deception, lying, and so on in a way that can really hurt our relationships. So we're going to build on some of those ideas for today. And again, you can draw from this in some of the ways that you might be understanding the harder parts of your conversations for your final essay. And I think these are also useful skills for us to know, since over the course of the class that we've been trying to figure out how we can be better, more thoughtful, and more conscientious communicators. So this is an additional tool for us to think about by understanding, what communication that doesn't go well looks like. So, as another major reminder, a couple of you have already completed the extra credit. That is due by the end of the day today, where I'm asking you to bring in an outside source related to communication and use that to connect it to the course. It adds 28 points or 2% onto your grade, so this is the deadline to get that out. It's great if you're on the bubble of a grade that you want, or you just want an added buffer to get a really good grade. And then on the 15th, from 10 to noon, we don't have, a big cumulative formal exam. We just have the opportunity for you to share and do the work that you've brainstormed for today about your progress toward your final essay. Remember, if you can't make it in person, shoot me an email, and I'll give you a Zoom link so that we can have you on screen. And if you can't do either, then before 10 a.m. on Wednesday, please send me a video, 4 or 5 minutes long, that talks through that process and some of those questions you were working on, what you learned through the process of developing that essay so that we can hear from you. And it'll also be a chance for you, if you have any last-minute lingering questions about the essay and what I'm looking for, to turn that in. And then the essay is due the following day, on the 16th by midnight at the latest. So I have to turn in grades at the latest by noon on the 20th. I try to get them in as soon as possible, but of course to do that, I need to make sure that everybody has their assignments in. So if you know that your assignment is going to be late or you need additional help, please try to get that in before the 20th so that I can make sure everybody has their grades entered in on it. So that's where we're at this point in the quarter. Again, you'll have that final essay coming up. One question that came up in regards to the final essay is sort of about the content that you're analyzing, right? So maybe you're having a conversation with somebody and they tell a really interesting story, right? While the content of that story is interesting, remember that the focus of your essay should be on your conversation with that person, right? So, for instance, maybe you're talking to a roommate and they tell a story about the time that they and their friend went skiing. That might be fun and that might be interesting, but I think the thing that's especially interesting is how that person is telling their story. What are they using to describe that experience? What does that story do to connect to some of the models of friendship that we've talked about in the class? So you might think about how the things that that person is talking about relate to your relationship to them or the things that you know, right? So if you're just focusing on the content of what they're saying without sort of applying it to your conversation, that's an area to continue to work on and explain a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit again about some of the harder parts of communication, including things related to deception and aggression, and some of the resources, including those available at EOU that we can use to deal with some of those things, right? As a content or trigger warning, right, we are going to be talking about issues related to domestic violence, assault, and so on. So if that is a cause of concern for you, you're welcome if you need to step out or tune out or do whatever you need to do so. So when it comes to relational aggression, right, oftentimes when we think about aggressive and hurtful behavior, we think about a school bully, we think about physical violence, or we think about, a very visible physical infliction of harm. But we know that relational aggression, right, and the way that we hurt each other is not just through our actions, but also through our words, right? We may say sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt me. But we know in practice that words can be incredibly hurtful. And so it's important for us to think about how these things are at play, right? And we can use confrontation in our aggression toward hurting somebody, including somebody we have a relationship with, or the way that they feel accepted and included in our groups. For instance, calling somebody a name, right? Teasing them, particularly if they are not in on it or don't appreciate the humor, right? Ridicule, which is oftentimes a very public, like pointing at somebody and laughing at them, right? And verbal rejection, calling somebody a loser, saying, again, if you've seen a show or a movie like Mean Girls, right, you can't sit with us, which is a classic example of a lot of different forms of verbal aggression, right? So a lot of these confrontational things we might think about as being really common, particularly in primary and middle school. For a lot of us, we don't do that in the same way as people might at that age, but we do see a lot more non-confrontational strategies, right? Spreading rumors, spreading gossip, the way that we manipulate our social relationships to try to hurt other people. Again, an example of this is something like the use of microaggressions, right? There was a really cool campaign where it was women who were responding to the microaggression, you hit like a girl, by like showing how awesome they were at a variety of different athletic activities, right? So there's a lot of ways that things like that, those forms of verbal aggression are being responded to. Again, a lot of classic examples in media, including Mean Girls, really help us understand the role of relational aggression, right? One of the things that's interesting is to see the shift in where aggression is being found, right? So studies find that in the kind of preteen, right, early teenage years, there's a lot of gossip, right? If you had an interesting experience in middle school or junior high school dealing with things like gossip and rumors and all of that stuff, you know pretty well that this is a pretty big problem that hurts a lot of our relationships and conflicts. But as we shift more toward college, there tends to be a lot more focus on doing things like venting, right? Talking negatively about a person outside of that setting. And hey, venting can be a really good thing, right? It can be nice to have the chance to share and get your feelings out. But it can be used, right, to hurt other people. Minimizing, right, your own role. To what degree are you compliant of or supportive of things that are hurtful? Right, so if you have a friend who's making fun of somebody, you kind of laugh along and you don't really address it, right? But you know that it's hurtful, right? You're minimizing how you're contributing to the problem. Victim blaming, right, is a really big problem. That is suggesting that the person who is subject to things that might be, verbal or physical forms of harassment or abuse are somehow responsible, right, or asking for it. Those are examples of how we use victim blaming to create more problems in our relationships. So one campaign that I think is a really good example of the issues of verbal aggression, right, which is a more direct targeting of a person to bring them down through communication, has been the impact of this past year and a half on Asian and Pacific Islander communities, right? And that's a very, very broad brush that, of course, encompasses many, many different cultures. And not only broader experiences, but also Asian American students, right? People, including Pacific Islander, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, and Chinese Americans, and a whole variety, right, of walks of life have experienced, in many ways, targeted forms of violence and verbal aggression this past year and a half in relationship to COVID-19, right? A lot of the ways that those targeted attacks have happened have been for folks from these backgrounds who, on the basis of physical appearance, right, are assumed to be associated with the virus, right? Including people who would have been born and raised and grew up well outside anywhere or any place that had anything to do with COVID-19. So one campaign that came up, right, as more Asian and Pacific Islanders reported experiencing very targeted forms of violence and harassment was I am not a virus, right? Or broader campaigns that were trying to focus on stopping and addressing Asian hate. So that was a major kind of initiative that was trying to deal with and address forms of verbal aggression that had come up over the past year and a half in particular. I want to share a short clip. It's an example of some of the ways that this has been identified and in many ways dealt with.
Driven intermittent fasting is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, a month where we celebrate the history, culture, and traditions of Asians and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. But at a time when the Asian community is fighting increasing harassment and hate, young voices are inspiring others to speak up. My 13-year-old daughter and a friend organized a rally in Shoreline this weekend to take a stand against racism, discrimination, and violence.
It was really inspiring and all honks and thumbs that people gave. It felt really great and encouraging, and it really felt like I was making a difference because sometimes you can feel super alone. I think it's great in a positive way to share my voice because sometimes I'm kind of I don't know how to.
So I wanted to share that example, again, of not only identifying an example of verbal aggression, but also to point toward a lot of folks, right, including children who have been active in trying to address and deal with some of those targeted attacks. And again, there are a lot of ways that things like verbal aggression, as we've talked about, have connected to things like gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, disability, and so on, right? One of the biggest ways we encounter verbal aggression, right, is the use of a character attack, right? So if you've ever taken a course related to argumentation, like argumentative writing, right? Professor Benton over in English and Writing has some really good work in that area. So an ad hominem is where you're attacking the person rather than attacking their argument, right? So it might be saying, hey, it's really kind of scary out there. There's a ton of snow. I don't feel very safe to get out there. And somebody responds by saying, oh, you're a wimp, right? Not really addressing the concerns people have about the weather, but instead attacking that person and their personality. That's a problem, right? Because it can be hurtful, but it can also not really get at the content. And we see this all the time, from more than one political party in terms of how, politicians and general public are talked about, right? We see this all the time in comment sections of anywhere on the internet. Competence attacks. So this is one that particularly I find frustrating, right? I do a lot of research related to disability and marginalization. And one thing that I find frustrating is when people as an insult, right, compare somebody to a person with a disability, right, referring to somebody as bipolar or schizophrenic or that they have dementia, right, in a way that doesn't actually align with that person. Because what those kinds of attacks say is that for people that do have disabilities like dementia, that they are the bad thing that's being compared to, rather than people that are dealing with unique challenges and issues in their lives. So attacking somebody's competence can also be a form of verbal aggression, because rather than, again, the argument or the idea they're presenting, they're using some component of their identity as a way to say that they can't be thinking clearly, right? For instance, the use of gendered insults, right? Attacking folks who experience menstrual cycles, right, on the basis of that as a reason that somebody isn't rational, right, is a very sexist way that competence attacks are used too. The background attacks, right, would be attacking somebody's experience, right? So an example of that would be making fun of somebody's accent who is born or raised in an international background. Physical appearance, right? You see that again a lot, especially growing up. Name calling, maledictions. Some of the ones we brought up before, right, like teasing somebody, especially if it's kind of meant to hurt them and they're not in on the joke. Ridicule being a more public way to do that. Threats, right, that we talked about last class as well. Swearing at, right, or using that as a way to insult somebody. And also, we talked about nonverbal communication, the use of emblems, right, flipping somebody off, doing the finger would be an example of other ways that we can show aggression, right, through oftentimes things like road rage. So bullying, right, I think is a part of verbal aggression, or at least can be, but bullying is its own beast. And there's two things that make bullying unique and challenging, right? The first one is the idea that bullying involves a difference in power. Think about basically all the times that you've seen bullying depicted on TV or in a film, right? Oftentimes a bully is this character that's like very large, physically fit, right? Oftentimes older, maybe they're like a senior or a super senior, right? Or experiences where somebody has encountered bullying themselves, right? Has some level of power or authority over somebody else. That can also include things like a supervisor or employer, right? So power is one big part. The other big part of bullying, right, is that it involves the idea that it happens multiple times. It's not just that you have this one-off encounter with somebody that's aggressive. It's the idea that the bully attacks again and again and targets that person over and over again that creates me fear, right? Give me my lunch money again. So that can be physical, right? The actual use of physically hurting somebody else can be verbal. The way that we issue threats or attack somebody or make fun of them. And then it can also be about relationships, right? Relational bullying would involve manipulating our social relationships. Again, one tactic that's oftentimes used in a lot of abusive and hurtful relationships is for somebody to cause themselves to doubt other relationships and say, I don't really think you should see your friend anymore. I don't think they care about you, right? And using tactics like that can be really hurtful. In addition to that, right, one thing that we've seen discussed a lot over the past few years has been the role of cyberbullying, right? And there has been, as you might expect, an increase in the amount of cyberbullying over the last year and a half as more and more of our experiences have been moved remotely, like classes, like work, and so on. So cyberbullying, right, is, of course, using a lot of electronics. That can be the use of things like more personal messages, but it can also be, right, the broader circulation of social media, like circulating and sharing embarrassing photos, right? One example might be like the way that people's accounts are hacked, right? And photos of those people are circulated online, and so on, right? So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to understand if cyberbullying, right, is worse than face-to-face bullying or is experienced in a worse way. But both, of course, are really serious. Cyberbullying has happened in a lot of really unique ways. Again, like I mentioned, with some of the targeting of Asian and Pacific Islander people that we've seen over the past year and a half. If you've seen shows like The Office, right, or similar types of shows that deal with workplace comedy or workplace relationships, we know that oftentimes negative and abusive workplace relationships are played for laughs. But in reality, of course, there are a lot of ways that bullying in the workplace can be really hurtful and lead to a lot of really negative impacts. And bullying in the workplace is especially an issue because we think about like asymmetrical or unbalanced power relationships. A supervisor and an employee, right? Or a CEO or larger boss and an employee. If we think about a lot of some of the high-profile cases of a lot of issues surrounding abuse, right? You might think about the Penn State coach case a few years ago, right? That was dealing with this asymmetrical coach-student relationship that was inappropriate. So bullying in the workplace, it can involve isolation and exclusion, right? Singling out or targeting people and saying, hey, we're all going to go out to eat, but you're not invited. That can be a way to make people feel really shut out. Intimidation and threat, right? You should get this to my office or else. If you want to see a raise, you need to do this. Verbal threats, such as threatening somebody to fire them or replace them if action isn't taken that's constructive. Damaging professional identity, right, including the use of blackmail, is a tactic that unfortunately is common, right? So Title IX, right, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex and helps to provide support for people that experience aggression and abuse, prevents legally the way an employer or individual can retaliate against a case that comes forward, right? The idea being that if somebody comes forward about a case involving discrimination, that an employer can't just turn around and say, well, now I'm going to fire them, right? There's protections in trying to prevent that. But of course, problems in how we can do that effectively through the use of loopholes and so on. Limiting career opportunities, right? So if somebody is a reference or a letter of rec or a contact, right? If somebody is applying for a job and needs to get a reference check back to a place, that can be used sometimes as a tactic too. Obstructing work or work life, as I brought up last class, the idea that somebody, like an employer, is contacting you and saying, hey, you need to respond, you need to go to work today, and so on, in a way that's outside of acceptable or agreed upon communication. And then denial of things like due process or natural justice. Again, one of the big issues that we see in a lot of cases, again, like that Penn State case from a few years ago, is that there's a very concerted effort to cover up or prevent those cases from being heard or seen, right? We know that even though there's a lot of cases of abuse and harassment in the workplace, very few of them are formally reported or even investigated, right? Because of some of the major problems in going through that. So there's another quadrant that helps us to understand the role of responding to and dealing with things like aggression, bullying, and so on. And I think this is different from a lot of approaches because this is not suggesting that there is a best approach of the four, because there's a lot of reasons why somebody might choose one of the four given the situation, right? If somebody is in a potentially dangerous or harmful situation, a passive approach is not necessarily a bad thing if somebody is trying to survive or has a longer-term plan to get out of a really abusive or hurtful situation, or might not be able to for a lot of reasons, right? An aggressive response, generally speaking, means that somebody doesn't really think about the other person, but is willing to communicate, right? So if somebody flips you off while you're driving and you flip them off back or yell at them, right, that'd be an aggressive approach. You don't really care about them, but you do want to share your opinion back, right? Assertiveness, right? Assertiveness would mean that you are willing to communicate, but you also care about the other person. You care enough to share and say, hey, I don't appreciate this name that you called me. I think that it's hurtful. I'd like to work with you on stopping it. Passive aggression, right? So this can be a tactic we see a lot and one that can be really frustrating. It can involve things such as hinting something, muttering under your breath, and so on. The idea here, though, is that oftentimes passive aggression is self-serving, right? It fulfills a self-fulfilling prophecy where you say, oh, it's so annoying that this person is always late. And then they show up late and they say, oh, you made it. You finally made it, right? And then that continues a narrative where that person is late, you're frustrated with them. You don't really communicate with that about them or, show the care to address that, right? So passive aggression can be a problem because you're not taking the effort to address the issue, and the other person doesn't recognize the issue and doesn't feel like they care about the issue, such to improve. Again, passive approach might be rolling with it, right? If somebody uses an insult or makes fun of you, right? It might be laughing it off, not really responding, ignoring the message, and so on. Oftentimes in the hope that that avoidance or passive approach will cause the issue to no longer exist. Deception is another key issue, as we brought up last class, right? The problem of gaslighting, which again, I think is a term that is used really, really broadly, but it describes a specific scenario in which somebody tries to manipulate somebody's senses about the world, right? To cause them to doubt. So gaslighting is not somebody who genuinely forgot that they said something. It's somebody who intentionally tries to get other people to doubt how they're feeling or understanding something. So intentionally saying something and then saying, oh, I never said that. It said better. But that gets into the broader category of deception, which we can think about as causing somebody to believe the wrong conclusions in a way that is meant to hurt them, right? Falsification is going to a bar with a fake ID, right? It's sharing information that's just incorrect. Concealment, right, would be hiding, really important, or big details. So if somebody just got fired and they got home from work and they were like, oh, how did things go today? And you say, oh, things went well, and didn't bring up the important issue that they might need to know given the context, that'd be concealing. And equivocation, right, is not intentionally a lie, but still misleading. So that's the idea. Oh, 2's a number, 1's a number, therefore 2 equals 1, right? That would be a flaw in a syllogism or logical reasoning. Just because those things are numbers does not mean they're equal. Another example would be, somebody asks you, they make food for you, and they ask, how is it? How'd you like it? And you say, oh, wow, well, you did make a lot of food, or, that is a meal, right? Where you're observing something outside of the actual thing that you're being asked about, as in the means of deflecting the conversation. So earlier in the quarter, we talked about Dr. Stella Ting-Toomey's work in face work and face negotiation theory. One of the key ideas, right, that Stella Ting-Toomey brings about is the idea that we have a face or a persona or a way that we present ourselves to other people every day, right? We wear that as a way to manage our social relationships. As a result of that, we might lie, including the use of white lies, as a way of saving face and maintaining good relationships. So relational maintenance is a big reason why we might choose to lie or be misleading in our relationships. We want to maintain a good relationship, and we might say, oh yeah, your food was delicious, as a way of keeping a good relationship with our friend, rather than being honest and maybe hurting their feelings. Managing face needs, right? So you could lie and say, oh, getting to work was no problem, the snow was fine, because you want a reputation as positive or something like that. You might recall earlier in the quarter, we were talking about dialectical tensions, particularly as they relate to family, romantic relationships, and so on. What is an example of the dialectical tension? Yes?
Ideal versus real?
Yeah. That's a good example, Jill, right? The idea that in our romantic relationships, there's this pedestal of what we want our relationship to be, but also what we have to deal with currently in our relationship, right? Are we thinking aspirationally, or are we dealing with our current concerns? So that is one way of dealing with tensions. Another one might be, being open versus being interconnected, right? So one way we might lie as a way of negotiating tensions would be to say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm really busy, I can't go out tonight, even though you are available, because you want more openness, and you're dealing with that tension by intentionally lying in order to create more distance. Relational control might be a reason we lie too. Again, we could deceive somebody in order to control how the relationship evolves. Such as, again, saying, hey, I'm not available, but let's meet next week, to control how frequently you meet that person. We might also lie to continue a previous deception, right? So lies kind of snowball off of each other. You lie about one thing, then you have to lie about something else, then you have to lie about something else, right? When I was a kid, I took voice lessons, and my teacher was really pushy and insisted that I keep taking lessons. And I really didn't want to do that anymore. I was super busy. So then I lied and said that I got a part in a school musical and I couldn't go, right? And then he started to ask me a bunch of questions about the musical and how the musical was going, right? It's that snowballing problem where you lie and then you have to do more lies and so on. I eventually fessed up and told him, I didn't get into it, but I was busy and didn't know how to say no. And there are still other reasons for lying that we still are learning and trying to figure out, right? The use of pathological lying, its relationship to mental health and so on, might be other issues that we need to continue looking at. So domestic violence is a really serious issue, and I just want to make sure that you know some of the resources. If you know anyone who has experienced this or in the future, right, you deal with issues related to domestic violence, right? As a faculty member, staff at UU, I'm a mandatory reporter, right? Should I be aware of anything related to that? So EOU, there's a lot of resources to help out. One of them is our Privileged Campus Advocate, who is a great resource that can directly work with and support people who might experience or who might know are experiencing issues of violence. Again, phone number and email is available there. Had Title IX, again, is designed for universities to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, and at institutions, including those in Oregon, right, it extends to issues such as gender identity and sexual orientation. So if you experience discrimination on those bases, or you know people that are experiencing those things, there's also the Title IX office to contact as well. So issues of domestic violence encompass a lot of different areas. Again, things like assault, battery, intimidation, and other abusive behaviors. The key idea here is the role of power and control. What was that? Battery is like the repeated use of physical violence, right? Particularly in the context of like a domestic partnership, right? Unfortunately, in the past, there used to be a lot of loopholes or exemptions that allowed domestic violence to, even in some situations, be legal between like partners, including those that were married. So that's where a lot of that comes from. And also to include, again, things like stalking, sexual violence, psychological aggression, and so on. And then there's a lot of reports, estimates, and work that continues to be produced, but it's estimated that it impacts 1 of 4 women, 1 in 10 men. There's less data surrounding non-binary folks, but there's still estimated very high numbers, right, violence that happens and targets non-cis folks in particular. So these are some really serious issues, right, and some ways that we can address some of these issues on campus, again, to create a more safe community. Again, I take the position that it's not a person's fault who experiences those things. It's the fault of an aggressor, and I think education is an important way to deal with and reduce violence that happens. So domestic violence, right? Again, my family comes from a background in psychology and counseling, and we found that a lot of the ways that domestic violence happens is through cycles, right? The patterns of parents who are abusive, and as a result, children who feel that that's the need to address issues. Oftentimes, right, it stems from the belief that using power and violence can solve the problem, right? It can get something to stop. And of course, often does so temporarily. And the use of things like reconciliation and apology is helpful if it's understood as a strategy of dealing with conflict earlier rather than later in a conflict, right? If more people are aware earlier on that these alternatives exist and can help, then that can be used to better defuse these issues as they happen. But again, the emphasis should be on the person who is engaging in cycles of violence to unlearn those behaviors and move toward more constructive approaches. So I'm not going to put you in small groups since I know we're right at the end of class, and I wanted to make sure you had time to complete your stuff at the beginning of today. But a couple questions to ponder, right, are the ways that face-to-face and cyberbullying can be felt differently. Again, we don't know that one is necessarily worse than the other, but cyberbullying is more persistent, right? It can happen in a lot of different settings, and it happens outside. But as we talked about in things like media richness theory, face-to-face bullying might be more intense, right? You're physically there, and you experience a lot more of your senses in that process. You might also think about how social media has changed things like bullying, right? The circulation of TikToks that might be making fun of somebody or hurtful, right, are an issue, as well as how quickly things can go viral or circulate on social media are a really big problem too. Again, I'm sorry to kind of end us on a pretty dark note, but hopefully next week we'll have a bit more fun and casual of a conversation. We talked a little bit about relational aggression, bullying, and issues of domestic violence and power. Again, these are serious issues, and I hope that some of the resources we talked about are useful if you have a personal relationship to any of these kinds of problems. And then for next class, I'm really looking forward to you sharing your progress on this final paper. Again, a lot more fun than the kind of stuff we've been talking about today. Let me know if you can't make it, and I'll send a Zoom link, and then send a video if you can't make that either. As a reminder, please complete and turn in instructor evals if you're not able to do so today. Please keep on your radar the 16th due date, and I hope that you have a great rest of your Friday and enjoy the snow day today. I know my dog loved it. Please pass forward your attendance activities for today. and I will see you soon.